but thought this would be a very opportune moment to tap two very prominent practitioners and economists on both sides of the aisle, and to give us some of their insights and thoughts on this. So it is my pleasure to first welcome Tomas Philipson, who will be followed by some insights from Jeffrey Sachs. And if I may give a brief introduction of the two of them. Tomas Philipson was born and raised in Sweden and holds an undergraduate degree in mathematics from Uppsala University. After earning an MA in mathematics from Claremont Graduate University, he went on to receive his MA and PhD in economics from the Wharton School of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania, after which he joined the University of Chicago as a postdoctoral fellow and faculty member. He has been visiting faculty member at Yale University and a visiting fellow at the World Bank. Felipson is widely published on the subject of health-related economic policy and is also the recipient of numerous related awards. Philipson served in the George W. Bush administration as the senior economic advisor to the Food and Drug Administration and subsequently as a senior economic advisor to the head of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. He was an advisor to Republican Senator John McCain during his 2008 presidential campaign, and in August 2017, Philipson was appointed by President Donald Trump to serve as one of 3 members of the Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA. Philipson played a leading role in the Trump administration's effort to oppose Medicare for All, to promote Trump's deregulation agenda, and the 2017 Republican tax legislation. After Kevin Hassett resigned as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in June 2019, Philipson was named as acting chairman. He left the White House recently in June, and we are very pleased to welcome you, Tomas, and look forward to your very upfront and insightful insights into the Trump administration's economic agenda, and to help shed some light on what our membership can look towards and expect going forward should Mr. Trump prevail again. I want to encourage all of our listeners and participants to submit your questions. You can do that by pressing the chat function on your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can, but this is a very good opportunity for you to ask the questions very much related to your own businesses too. Following Dr. Philipson's talk, we will look to the perspective from the Democratic side, and for that we are honored to be joined by Jeffrey Sachs, who is an American economist, academic, public policy analyst, and former director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where he holds the title of university professor. I will say he was my professor when I did my MA at Columbia, and very happy to welcome him. He is known as one of the world's leading experts on sustainable development, economic development, and the fight against poverty. Sachs is director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University today and the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He is an SDG advocate for United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres on the Sustainable Development Goals, and he held the same position under the previous UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And prior to 2016, held a similar advisory position related to the earlier Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, to which he was appointed as a special advisor by then UN Secretary Kofi Annan. Sachs is a co-founder and chief strategist of Millennial Promise Alliance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ending extreme poverty and hunger. He is co-editor of the World Happiness Report, and in 2010, he became a commissioner for the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, whose stated aim is to boost the importance of broadband in international policy. Sachs has written several books and received many awards, and has been a prolific and outspoken critic of the Trump administration's economic policy. So we are in for an interesting insight into both sides of this aisle, and look very much forward to welcoming you both. And we will jump right in with you, Tomas. And I'd like you to just tell us about your time at the White House and how you see things going forward.
Sure. What's the timing roughly on how long you want me to talk versus Q&A?
Well, I think if you speak for 25 or so minutes, maybe, and we'll sort of gauge how many questions we get. We had some questions already submitted to us, but I will give you some time cue if I feel like we're running out of time.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for having me. Let me first, for those of you who are not really familiar with how the US government works in terms of logistics, Council of Economic Advisors is one of the two main groups within the White House. The National Economic Council, headed by Larry Kudlow currently, is the other group that coordinates and advises the president on economic policy, and also coordinates with the departments of the executive branch, which is mainly for economic policies, Commerce Department, Treasury Department, and the United States Trade Representative. Basically, we're in-house in the White House versus the departments, which are outside the White House, but we coordinate a lot of economic policy and advise the president with those other departments. In terms of describing Trump economic policy, the way we thought about it was essentially that there were four pillars to it. One was tax relief, particularly to stimulate investment, where the overriding view was essentially that the best way to help workers is to raise demand for workers, and the best way to raise demand for workers is to stimulate a good business environment, investment environment. So that was one pillar. Second pillar is deregulatory reform or regulatory relief. And the president was really unique and basically deregulated more even than Reagan did in the 80s in terms of setting up a regulatory budget that had a cut in regulation. There were two regulations for every new regulation that took place. A lot of those regulations within the Office of Management and Budget, which is the regulatory body within the White House, are healthcare regulations. So I was quite involved in those. The third pillar was energy independence to stimulate private innovation as opposed to public directed innovation in energy. And the fourth pillar was essentially guaranteeing that US manufacturers and sellers were treated equally well abroad as we treated sellers and manufacturers in the US. So fair or reciprocal trade agreements was central, and obviously to a Trump policy. The main result of this, and what I'm talking about, if you want a document that describes all this, there's an annual report by the Council of Economic Advisors, my group, that's called the Economic Report of the President. It comes out with the budget of the president every year around February. And that report is about 200 or 300 pages long, but it details in different chapters sort of what is the vision, economic vision of the policies of the president, but also what is the evidence on how those things are working. So in terms of evidence, there was a lot of positive sort of effects of these policies in this 3 years leading up to COVID. And to summarize, essentially, we had a very rapid growth relative to expectations. So the way usually that recoveries from recession, we had the Great Recession, financial crisis, obviously in 2008 in the US and the rest of the world. But usually the way that happens is that you have very rapid growth post a recession. So it's sort of like a pendulum. The more you swing back. And so the typical pattern after recession is rapid growth, and then it kind of tapers off into less growth. What we saw after the Great Recession was exactly the opposite. And you see that in the expectations that were sort of projected from economists. Early on, many economists after the Great Recession in the Obama years were over predicting growth, and many economists under Trump were under predicting growth relative to what actually happened. So after the Great Recession, we saw actually a slow growth, a very sluggish growth, recovering from it. And then when Trump took office in 17 and 18 and 19, we saw a much more rapid growth, especially relative to how late in the cycle was. Late in the cycle it was. This also occurred even though Obama had stimulated federal or Fed policy, monetary policy and fiscal policy. So there was a lot of monetary and fiscal policy that pushed towards higher growth in Obama, which then disappeared under Trump. I don't know if you remember, but before COVID, we had a lot of increases, rate hikes from the Fed during the Trump years, and there was a lot of tension between the White House and the Fed. As a result, those rates went down to zero as soon as COVID came in. But essentially, you had more rapid growth in later part of the cycle under Trump with more restraining federal Fed policy. So we saw a large gain in both in growth relative to expectations, particularly in the lateness in the cycles. In addition, we saw, which was very important, is that growth mainly took place among the low wage individuals. So the income growth was much more rapid in the lower part of the wage distribution than it was in the upper part. And therefore, inequality, both in income and in wealth, declined during Trump before COVID. So you had both positive news for growth, but also for whatever you want to call social justice, what have you. But inequality was declining. Both income and wealth inequality was declining. Again, I would refer you to the economic report of the president to basically read through some of the findings that we had around these policies. One important debate that occurred was there was a lot of tax relief for investors in the Trump tax reform that took place in December 2017. And there was a huge debate, and many sort of colored this in the rhetoric. This was sort of a tax break for the rich, was the rhetoric that was surrounding this. But naturally, it led to a big boom in investment. That boom then tapered off, partly because of our own policies, in my view. And I got a lot of crap from people within the White House, but there was clearly a lot of uncertainty around our trade policy at that time in 18 and 19 that dampened that investment. So we saw a huge growth in investment in response to the tax reform, and therefore a growth in labor demand and wages. But that was dampened later on because there was so much uncertainty about renegotiating the trade agreement that took place, and that usually hits investment. Any kind of uncertainty hits investment pretty quickly. And so the later part of the first 3 years were sort of plagued by this, whatever you want to call it, it's a renegotiation uncertainty. We renegotiated, obviously, trade agreements, particularly with China, which was finally concluded in January this year. But that renegotiation, by definition, led to uncertainty to what it would lead to. And that dampened, or that raised uncertainty in the markets and particularly affected investments. In terms of the COVID policy, I think no one was expecting what would happen in this year. And the Council of Economic Advisors, without having any forecast ability at all, actually wrote a report in September 2019, that is to say 3 months before COVID hit, on the value or need of essentially being prepared for a pandemic and the value and need of having more rapid vaccine production in the middle of pandemic. And that turned out to be very useful 3 months later. Again, we obviously didn't know what was coming. But many times in the media, it's been portrayed that the president didn't take this seriously. So I kind of want to go through how serious we took it. Obviously, the whole White House was, laser focused on this starting even January. And there were 5 actions that sort of demonstrated how seriously we took this, I think. One was, which was very new at the time, and now every country is doing it, is that we shut off immigration from China in late January, January 31, I believe. And that at the time was highly criticized, in particular from Biden, as a measure to control the pandemic. Not many countries are doing it. So that was kind of an historic move, but a very early move relative to other countries That's the first one. The second one was obviously that we not shut down. There was federal action that was voluntary. We suggested here's what should be done, but states holds the mandatory sort of right to shut down state economies. But essentially we were shut down for 6 weeks in the US, pretty much. That was also historical. It's never been done before to control an infectious disease. The third action I think was historical was the healthcare mobilization through the private sector with the private sector partnership that took curve to essentially have a hospital capacity being available for the increasing number of new cases. There was an enormous mobilization of the private sector, particularly in the ventilator space, to have enough capacity to meet new cases, and to basically, Council of Economic Advisors was part of a team to set up how ventilators could be traded across the countries from low urgency areas to high urgency areas over time, essentially a credit market in ventilators that you could trade them over time to have enough for your particular hospital. So that's the third action that I think that was kind of historic. The fourth action that was historic was the Keras Act, which was the largest stimulus program ever mounted with $3 trillion on the fiscal side, where the president worked with Congress, obviously, to generate it, but also the Fed side in terms of providing lending opportunities that were not there before. Lastly, the fifth historical measure, I think, was what's called Operation Warp Speed. And that alluded to, that was very related to the CA report, my group's report in 2019, of how to basically speed up a vaccine production in the middle of a pandemic to not have these long regulatory delays by agencies approving new vaccines. In the US, it's called the Food and Drug Administration. And for example, what that did was to subsidize for the private sector the production of a vaccine at the same time it's being approved by the government for safety and efficacy, meaning that you have parallel production, which would not, at-risk production, if you want, would not take place in the private sector without public subsidies. I think in terms of COVID policy, I think it's very important to essentially think about what in a scientific way, which I don't think that medical experts are trained to do. In a scientific way, think about the trade-offs involved in between prevention and health. So an infectious disease essentially imposes two costs. One is the disease itself, obviously, in terms of mortality and morbidity, but also it imposes a cost of prevention. So the way I think about this is sort of as highway mortality. If you have highway mortality, we can shut down that highway mortality by closing highways. No one thinks that's a sensible policy, even though it maximizes health. So there's a trade-off between cost of prevention and the disease itself. And we have actually looked at that both at the Council of Economic Advisors. And if you look at the total loss of the disease, both the prevention costs and the disease costs, US did very well. We've done a lot better than Europe, for example. And Sweden actually did very well, although I understand you had some issues with your nursing homes in terms of mortality, but you did have lower costs of prevention by letting economic activity take place. So I wrote a national review piece on summarizing that evidence, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, because medical expertise is not the only expertise that goes into this, and many times they're very uninformed about the particular trade-offs involved, the quantitative trade-off. Everyone can talk about this, but what are the quantitative trade-offs that need to be assessed? And in fact, I advised the president even in March, when we were sort of so-called bending the curve of having hospital capacity, being able to meet the demand of new infections, that there should be a sort of a two-part strategy, which I think Sweden is kind of close to implementing, or we're early to implement. Now most countries are implementing that strategy. And that two-part strategy is essentially to invest in taking care of the high-risk individuals, that is to say, old or people with the pre-existing conditions, At the same time, you let the low-risk individuals drive the economy. So essentially, the high-risk individuals most of the time are economically inactive, or at least on the supply side of the economy, and you can invest in taking care of them, while at the same time letting the low risks, who are essentially in the US, we have a case fatality risk of this disease that's pretty much in line with the flu, participate in the economy. And the vaccine, I think, is basically the most important component of that strategy, because what you really need to focus on is to vaccinate the old. The young is not necessarily going to take it, at least not in the US. Swedes might be more susceptible to taking vaccines than US individuals are. But it's really important to basically focus high vaccination rate among the high risk, because then you break that transmission link through economic behavior or economic participation of the low risk in the economy, and then going home and infecting parents or grandparents. And that's been a big discussion point here in the US in the last few weeks. At warp speed is predicted to have a vaccine probably within 2020 or late November even. And the question is, how do you go after high risk individuals, which will have an enormous mortality effect, even if it doesn't have a large vaccination rate in the population. So in the US, 85% of mortality of COVID is in the plus 65 population. So if that older population is vaccinated, mortality will fall dramatically with a successful vaccine, even though the vaccination rate in the population as a whole might not be very large. In retrospect, I think that the fiscal policy in respect to COVID turned out to be too much. I've written on, and other people have followed, that the Keras Act, which was provided a $3 trillion stimulus, actually raised disposable income. Disposable incomes is essentially private income you get in the private sector, plus any government transfers that you get, in this case through CARES. It turns out that the disposable income on average in the US rose 45% annualized, which is in comparison, it's 4 times the size of an economic boom, let alone a recession. So we have one of the worst recessions on record in terms of GDP cuts, but at the same time, income was exploding 4 times more than regular boom. That's telling you that the liquidity provided by CARES was in retrospect, too high. We see the same thing with current stimulus discussions, in my view. We have a $2 trillion package on the table that's being discussed, but we only have about 10 million workers who have not gone back to the labor force since March. So if you look at, we lost about 22 million jobs in COVID. About 12 million of those are already back in the labor force through the recovery since then. So we have 10 million workers left. So a $2 trillion spent, if you're trying to help stranded workers who can't get work because of the infection, that's about $200,000 per worker. If you're providing liquidity for a quarter, you're essentially replacing a salary of $800,000, which is quite a bit. So it's telling you that it's kind of misguided in terms of being targeted to those that really need it. In terms of the differences with Trump and Biden, I think obviously this election is unique because there's such stark differences between the two. Usually competition for the electorate in the US leads to that the Democrats and Republicans can barely be seen, the differences can barely be seen. But this election, there's such stark differences, and that imposes risks particularly on the financial markets, because depend on who wins the election, particularly, more importantly, who wins the Senate. Currently, the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and if it keeps being controlled by Republicans, I think we're going to see everyone thinks we're going to see a lot fewer differences between the past and the future than if Biden wins in a presidential election and the Democrats also takes the Senate and still controls the House. That will be a very different world in terms of economic policy. Biden is obviously more centered on government enrollment or government involvement than Trump is, which is much more a private sector type of president. You can call it whatever you want. If you want to have more regulations and more publicly financed government. People here call it socialism, but that's just a term. But certainly he's more for public financing of various activities and more regulations. Now, how is that greater government involvement being implemented? It's essentially implemented by an enormous, whatever you want to call it, but it's almost like an attack on business investment, in particular in a weak economy after COVID, which makes many people like me very skeptical. And most of his revenue that he wants to collect about $3 trillion over 10 years in revenue, are from taxes on investment. There's capital gains taxes and corporate taxes that are being raised. And many economists like me worry about the difference between what we call statutory taxes, basically who sends in a tax to the Internal Revenue Service, the Treasury Department that collects the taxes, versus actually who's hurt from the taxes, which we call tax incidence. So if you think of a simple example, if you put a sales tax on a competitive market, many times that competitive market just means that they raise the price of the product. So even though the manufacturer sends in the sales tax to the government, the one who's really hurt by the sales tax is the customer in the market who has a higher price for the product. That's a difference between who you say you're taxing, who's actually paying the tax. And for Biden's sort of revenue source being investment, it's very important to keep in mind that most economists I know believe that in a market where you have this going on, where you tax people, when capital or investors are mobile, they're not going to pay the tax. Who's going to pay the tax is going to be labor. So the way I think about this in simple terms, if you have a car lanes on a highway going to the airport or wherever you're going, it turns out that the car lanes on the highway always go roughly of equal speed. And the reason is because when one lane goes slow, people switch out of that lane into a faster lane. And the end result is that you sort of have speed equalized across all the lanes going on the highway. After tax or capital investment kind of works the same way, where after tax returns are equalized, because if people are in a low return industry, they will switch over to a high return industry, thereby driving down returns in that industry. So when the government slows down a US investment, if US investment is a lane on the highway and the government slows down the speed, we're going to have a lot more exit out of investment. And ultimately, what economists think this leads to, if you don't have an investment, you have less demand for labor. If you don't have less demand for labor, you have lower wages and fewer workers. And so even though you're taxing capital, you're basically hurting labor. And this is not me saying this. This is sort of a well-established economic literature that the mobile part of the economy, the people who can move away from the taxes, don't pay the taxes. The people who pay the taxes in this case is going to probably be labor. And you saw that under Trump. We reduced capital taxes quite dramatically, and you saw a huge surge in wages, particularly the low end part of the wage distribution. So I think it's the rhetoric around Biden's plan is very different from, I think, how it will actually affect workers. It's basically a hit to workers by lowering the demand for them. In addition, Biden is obviously imposing a lot more regulations than Trump would if he were to be reelected. And those regulations have been analyzed and have been shown to be very regressive, meaning hitting the poor part of the population a lot more than they're hitting the rich part, particularly because energy and housing costs, et cetera, are a much higher share of the budget of poor individuals than they are for rich individuals. So Biden has proposed roughly $3 trillion in taxes over a decade. He has proposed more than that, almost 3 times as much, $9 trillion in new spending. So some way or another, this is going to have to be covered by new debt if you were to implement these policies. And I think this illustrates an important point, which is He claims to only want to, go after individuals with more than 400,000 in income in terms of taxes, even though I just discussed why that's not necessarily the impact of those taxes. But it proves the point that when you have a large government, many times, including in Europe, or particularly in Europe, you have to go to regressive taxes, meaning taxing the middle income. You can't fund a big government just off the back of rich people. One, they're too mobile, and two, they're too small. So in Europe, you rely a lot more on sales taxes and payroll taxes, which are much more regressive than the US regressive income taxes that we have here, meaning they're paid more by the middle class. In addition, the debt that's going to be collected, I think, is unfortunate because it's on top of a COVID policy, which has been a massive redistribution from the young to the old. Not only are the young picking up the tab for the large fiscal programs, the Keras Act and the $2 trillion that are being currently discussed, because it's all borrowed money. In addition, the young are paying the cost of a mitigation. Like I said, the old individuals are the ones who are benefiting from mitigation, as most of the health impact of the disease is in the old population. But the young individuals are the ones paying the costs in terms of prevention by not participating in economic activities. So you have a massive transfer from the young, a financial transfer from the young towards better health of the old, essentially, is what's going on. And you're topping that off by about 6 trillion in debt, the difference between 9 trillion in spending and 3 trillion in taxes that are being planned to put on the young on top of that massive transfer that COVID is generating. An additional difference between Biden and Trump is that Trump's spending, I should say, is much more on what economists call public goods, meaning activities that only the government can do, meaning defense. So you can't buy defense in the supermarket for good reasons because everyone benefits from it, and therefore everyone would expect everyone else to pay it. So we can't sell defense in private markets. And that's really where the spending increase has been by Trump, as opposed to Biden, whose spending increases are for industries that actually could be, where the industry could be private, but being replaced by a publicly financed activity. The most central ones are higher education, which is after high school, so universities, where there's a lot of spending on essentially debt financing that education for the students. And then obviously healthcare, which is expanding with a public option or a government subsidized option for people to participate in. If you look at education, so for people who believe that markets work, and they think these are poor policies, in particular, if you look at education in the US education for grammar schools is very poor in terms of international standards. It's also where you have public involvement. In particular, you have no competition for grammar schools. They're based on where you live. So you basically have a locked-in demand for customers by just residing in a particular neighborhood. There's no competition. School choice or vouchers is the solution to that, where students in a given neighborhood can select other schools outside the neighborhood, and therefore impose a lot more competition between the schools to attract them. Right now in the US, when you buy a house, you buy an education, and that bundling is essentially preventing competition for grammar schools. The end result has been a horrible set of grammar schools, particularly in the inner cities for minorities, where minorities cannot select out of those because they can't afford to move away from the neighborhood. The Trump administration has been very forward in promoting school choice with the Secretary of Education, making that one of the main policies they're concerned with, particularly to help minorities. Now go to higher education in the US, universities, which if you take various measures, are probably one of the highest, one of the best set of universities across the world. The difference, in my opinion, is that in higher education in the US, you have very vigorous competition. Universities bid for professors, universities try to attract students across the country. And that's actually unique in the US as opposed to many other countries which have public universities where prices are set and competition a lot more limited. So within the same country, you have a government takeover of schooling has resulted in very poor schooling. When you have competition, even between public and private schools in the US, it's resulted in a very, very strong university system. Biden wants to now have a government takeover, essentially, of the higher education, not so much in terms of production, in terms of state universities, but in terms of financing. But once you control the financing, you control what the universities do, because you're going to tell them this is what you have to do to get the money. And that's a very dangerous situation, in my view. People have analyzed the difference between Biden and Trump quite extensively. We have just had a new study coming out of the Hoover Institution by some old CA economists looking at the damaging effects of the Biden economic plan in terms of the higher taxes and the increased spending in these areas where private competition could be beneficial. So I will stop at that kind of comparison, and I'll be happy to take some questions if there are some.
Thank you, Tomas. Let me see if I can get the video going here. Thank you. We have some questions on a wide array of topics, but I want to encourage all of you to use your chat function there and submit your questions. We still have some time with Dr. Philipson, so this is a good time for you to take a look maybe at your own business and ask some questions that might be relevant to that. But I'll start with the first one. How do you explain the acceptance by GOP and Trump to increase budget deficit to 3 times as high as it was during Obama? Isn't that the main driver of the economic growth, i.e. unfinanced tax cuts?
So, like I said before, I think the difference here is that most of that budget deficit occurred due to military spending. There was an enormous growth in military spending, which was really depleted in some sense, of 750 billion for 2 years. I believe it was 18 and 19 or 17 or 18. So I think the president took on essentially rebuilding our military. The president's very Reagan-esque, if you want, in his view that the best possible outcome is that we don't use this military, but it's basically peace through strength. And I think he viewed his role as building it up, and it was more of a one-time effect on the deficit had we not gotten COVID and had we gotten economic growth. So the way we viewed it is that we had to reset certain policy initiatives. One was to build up the military, and one was to generate an economic environment that was much more friendly to business at the time, and by doing so, would generate future economic growth that would then finance this deficit in the future. Obviously, with COVID, that has taken a hit, but hopefully, if we get COVID under control with the vaccine and we get to continue, that will not be the case.
President Trump, during his campaign, made a wide and big promise that he was going to present an infrastructure bill and he was going to get it done. He has failed. Why did he not do it?
Well, I think there was a lot of, I wasn't particularly involved. National Economic Council was much more, they had a bunch of infrastructure experts in National Economic Council. CA was not so involved, but generally there was a lot of haggling between Congress and the president on the infrastructure bill at the time. This was in 18 where it was most heightened, the discussion. And I think part of the reason was that he wanted a much more private sector public partnership in the bill, and where we utilized the private sector much more to build infrastructure. He also wanted a lot more deregulation in terms of getting infrastructure projects done. Sometimes now it takes 20 years from start to finish to get it done. Most of that time is through various forms of agencies within the federal and state governments having to approve various projects. He obviously, as a developer, real estate developer, not an infrastructure developer, was highly familiar with this, how inefficient the process was of getting permits to build. And that was a big sticking point on what Congress wanted versus what the administration wanted.
And a question on healthcare, close to your heart. You criticize or you hailed Trump's approach to healthcare and the abolishment of the ACA. Yet the GOP and Mr. Trump have not offered an alternative in 4 years.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's, again, a failure of a Republican Congress and a Republican White House to get it done. Everyone, I believe that was a failure. I think the issue was that we wanted a better plan than Obamacare. Obamacare has not been successful. Everyone wants to help the poor and everyone wants to help people with pre-existing conditions. I think that's universal across the two parties. The question is how you do it. And Obamacare was a highly regulatory approach to healthcare, and it raised premiums, and it had a lot of adverse effects that were kind of predictable and some were not so predictable. But that's where we came in, and we wanted more state subsidized programs where the local governments took more of a role than the federal government in these programs. And I think there was a breakdown in process more than anything when McCain put his thumb down as the sort of pivotal vote of that program.
A follow-up question came in here to that, saying how do you account for the many millions of Americans who lost access to health care during Trump's administration, and again with no alternative offered?
Well, I mean, the issue was how well Obamacare essentially took care of these individuals. And we made a choice early on. There was a choice early on, which was the more cynical version would have been to run Obamacare into the ground, basically showing up bad it was. And that was not decided upon, obviously. But so the question is, if we have Obamacare, we want to run it as well as we can. And that was kind of the approach taken by the Trump administration. But there's a lot of parts of Obamacare that are raising premiums for people, and that makes it unaffordable, and that makes people not buy it. And that's the parts that we wanted to change, to have more competition, for example, and to have less government regulations that basically impose certain constraints on the markets to operate in ways that raise premiums. And I think that's the difference in approach. But we were basically, after it failed, after the vote failed, and the Republicans didn't want to go back and sort of talk about a new healthcare plan until after this election, essentially in November this year. So we'll see what happens if we have success in this election. But presumably we would need success in the Senate as well, and in the House. So that's probably not a likely outcome.
On to climate change. Climate change has been calculated by many prominent economists to have an enormous negative economic impact. Yet the Trump administration both ignores and ridicules the effects of climate change. Do you agree with that approach?
I don't think we ignore and ridicule stuff. I think that's a false assessment. So I think the issue is that how much you want state-directed innovation, which failed clearly under Obama. They tried to have the state push energy innovation in a particular direction. It was a dramatic failure. What happened during Obama was that we got a cleaner environment through private innovation. Essentially, the shale revolution, although many people dislike it, compared to the alternative, it took a lot of it took a lot of coal production or utilization away, substituted into gas. And that actually became, relative to the alternative, an environmentally friendly policy. And that was merely through private innovation. I think the difference is how we view one of two things. One is how much the private sector should lead that innovation, as opposed to having the government pick winners and losers. And then second, how much the US paid relative to other countries, even though the US is doing fairly well relative to other countries in terms of emissions, how much we were paying in international agreements for this. We want to renegotiate it, obviously. And I think those are the two different sticking points between the two parties.
Okay, we have two questions on education. One of the questions is how do you measure and tell the difference between good and bad school? How would competition improve that measurement? And a second one around vouchers, stating that vouchers are a non-starter in so many areas, poverty-driven areas, where no one is or able to start and begin to found schools because there is no profit or ability to do so. So how does the Trump administration's approach to improving education in poverty-stricken areas answer to that?
So a couple of points. There's not only vouchers, but also the opportunity zone in poverty-stricken areas. But to the first point, how do you measure quality of schools? I think it's ultimately where parents want to send their kids. It determines what it's a good school or not. We don't measure quality. The government doesn't go out and measure quality for a bunch of goods and services. What determines quality is where demand goes. We call those things successful and valuable relative to where demand doesn't go. So I think it's clear that inner city schools have failed their neighborhoods, and they're providing part of the reason, not necessarily the only reason, but part of the reason is that people cannot select out of that neighborhood, and they're stuck in the neighborhood because of their income, that they can't buy a house or apartment or rent a house or apartment in another neighborhood. And I think it's really about supporting the teachers unions, which the Republicans don't do, but the Democrats do, in basically limiting competition for these schools so that teachers are safe, as opposed to looking at what would the poor kids and their families benefit from. And clearly it's hard to argue that they would suffer from having an opportunity to choose outside their neighborhood. It seems a very strange argument to argue that would hurt a family in a poor neighborhood if they could choose a school outside their neighborhood. So I think it boils down to, honestly, whether the teachers union is supporting the Democratic Party, and that's why you have this strange resistance by the Democratic Party to help poor, inner city kids get a better education. In terms of supporting poor neighborhoods in the U.S., an important initiative I didn't talk to, which is sort of similar to the corporate tax cut we did on a national level, is the opportunity zones that we created in the US. Those were essentially low-income neighborhoods that qualified for tax breaks for investments. So instead of investing anywhere in the US, capital was treating more favorably if it invested in poor neighborhoods in the US. And last time we measured, about $100 billion have gone into these neighborhoods because of these tax breaks. And the idea was exactly the same I talked about before. If capital and investment is driven into a particular neighborhood, demand for workers in that neighborhood will go up, and hopefully wages and employment as a result will go up in that neighborhood. That's been in a very successful program. Senator Scott has been part of the team that worked with the White House to implement the program. But I think it's an overlooked program relative to how much other things are discussed in terms of helping minorities in the U.S.
The Census Bureau's recent current population survey showed an extraordinary drop in poverty in 2018 and 2019. Is this just a change in methodology, or why isn't this more of a focus?
It is the focus. That's the first thing we talk about. essentially the lower part, like I discussed previously, the lower part of the income distribution gained most under Trump until COVID took place. COVID has been a very regressive policy in the sense that it hit the poor a lot more than the rich. The poor are essentially undertaking the prevention of the new infections by being shut out of the economy much more than the rich are, and helping the rich and old really by not engaging in economic activity. But pre-COVID, a lot of the growth took place in the lower part of the income distribution, and we had dramatic reductions in poverty at the time due to these policies. So when people use the rhetoric that these were tax breaks for the rich, etc., I think it's very misleading because, like I said, investment drives labor demand, and labor demand is ultimately how you lift people out of poverty.
On the PPP program, much criticism has been leveled towards the lack of oversight and of the distribution of PPP monies and the abuses therein, and where many large businesses were able to take advantage of those funds and small businesses were shut out. Was that a failure?
I think let me make a general point here that there's a lot of things with COVID where there can be what's called Monday morning quarterbacking in the US, meaning after the fact you say this is what we should have done, as opposed to at the time you're making the decision what information you have. So let's say you're, for example, as an illustration, if you're an investor and you're told at the end of the day what the rate of return was on a particular stocks, it's very easy to become a trillionaire over a week or whatever. If you, after the fact, you get to pick the best thing to do. It's very, very different at the time you're sitting making decisions with limited information to actually determine what happens. I think for PPP or the Keras Act in general, some of the larger companies did step out of it, some of them did not, and we realized quickly that more help was needed further down the line. There was also a means-tested component of Keras that essentially gave money to poor individuals in the economy who would need a liquidity. Keras in general was not a stimulus act. It was a liquidity act, meaning you had the government shut down the economy and people living paycheck to paycheck needed liquidity by not being able to go to work because the government action. It was not people view it incorrectly as, and currently in the discussion, it's called a stimulus package. That many times it's a de-stimulus package because we paid, in the US, we paid, unemployment insurance, which was much higher than the previous wages of many individuals. That's a very strong incentive to not go to work, not because people are lazy, it's just tilting people in that direction. It's like me putting on an online ad for a job that I want people to do for me and then asking them, can you pay me instead of me paying you? Very few people would, respond to that ad. But that's essentially what we had through the Keras Act. We had a more than 100% what's called an implicit tax. That is to say, if you went into work, you lost money taking place. So that's a de-stimulating effect on the economy, but it provided liquidity for people who were hurting. And I think it's kind of remarkable that we had such a quick comeback in the labor market, despite that we had this break on the labor supply in the market, meaning people don't want to work when they earn less working through the Keras Act. But again, coming back to your question, I think the PPP program got revised over time because we were kind of learning as we were going. And sitting at the end saying what you should or should not been done, I think is pretty easy.
Next question. Why doesn't the Trump administration emphasize that taking away the deductibility of state tax was a major tax increase for the rich, and Biden now wanting to reinstate it will be a giant tax break for the rich?
Yeah, we definitely, so that's what's called a SALT, state and local tax. For those of you that are not fully in tune with the US tax system, if you live in a state in California or New York, you have very high state taxes that were basically deductible. They could be taken out of your total tax bill from your federal taxes that you pay to DC. That was taken away in 2017. And what that means is that now if you're living in high state tax states such as California and New York, your state tax is paid on top of the federal tax, raising your total tax quite dramatically. As a consequence, we have seen massive, or not massive, I should say, we have large departures from high tax states when people are actually forced with paying the state's taxes for the large governments that they have in those states. I think, many people like me think it's a healthy development that the rest of the country should not subsidize large governments in other parts of the country, which is essentially what happened before 2017. In terms of marketing the change more, I think we haven't done enough on it, but I think it's a very important change of how local and state governments are financed. And I think it's a change in the right direction where people living in a particular state should pay for that state's government activities.
I'm going to ask you one last question. I'm happy to see that we have been joined by Professor Sachs. Welcome to you. Many of our businesses and members are very concerned about the newly imposed travel restrictions and work permit restrictions added on top of the travel restrictions, which are mostly health related, as we know, but this has put a major damper on business and the ability to move staff over the borders here. What do you expect if Mr. Trump wins another term he will do about that? Is that something that is to be expected to continue?
No, I think the major travel restrictions obviously are for COVID currently, and if Operation Warp Speed is successful in delivering a vaccine, right now, like I said, we're looking at end of November for Pfizer to come out with the first one, I believe. If that's true and we have successful adoption of a vaccine in a high-risk population, mortality will fall dramatically, and this becomes a low-risk disease if the old are vaccinated. If that's the case, I expect that we will have restrictions lifted quite rapidly after that in terms of the health-related restrictions. There's some other restrictions on visas that there was an immigration reform attempt where we had more sort of scoring of similar to other countries. We have a very unusual way of letting people in the US relative to other countries. And we wanted a more merit-based immigration reform, which Jared Kushner and CA actually worked quite a bit on in terms of generating similar policies to other countries, actually, to let people in the country. And I expect those will be pushed further if COVID stabilizes. Okay.
Thank you, Tomas Felipson, for being with us and giving us your insights from the White House and how you perceive another 4 years of Trump playing out for the business and trade community. It is now my pleasure to turn to Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, and looking forward to hearing your perspective from the other side of the aisle. Dr. Felipson has made the case for Trump's policies, having reduced poverty, increased work, stagnating wages is no longer a reality, and that businesses have and the American people have actually been positively impacted by economic policy. What say you?
Well, we're in the deepest economic and social crisis in modern American history since the Great Depression. We have soaring unemployment. We have millions of people who have left the labor market. We have inequality that is at an all-time high. We have a kind of barbarism in our policies. And God help us if Trump is reelected. He's a crook. He's a con man. He is deeply in debt himself. And he has used the federal government for his own enrichment. He caters to white supremacists. And I have absolutely nothing but disdain for this man and what he has done to American society. When COVID hit us this year, he has proven himself to be malevolent, anti-science. We couldn't even get to the level of wearing face masks, much less any coherent public health program. I'm not in love with what Sweden did, by the way, but at least Sweden did it in an honest, direct way. We did it with mass confusion. And we have 230,000 dead, 8.7 million people confirmed infected, many more times that have not been tested and therefore were not confirmed. We have people with long-term disabilities. We have the lowest employment ratio to the adult population in modern American history. That so-called boom was a boom for the stock market, but not a boom for the American people. The so-called jobs that were coming back and so forth was a bunch of nonsense. We had a trade war that brought nothing back except his desperate attempt to keep some jobs in coal, oil, and gas in the fossil fuel industry, because his ignorance about the environment is every bit as great as his ignorance about COVID and his indecency towards minority groups in this country. So I'm sorry to say it's not very measured what I'm saying, maybe not very polite, maybe not very Swedish, but this is simply the most disgusting president that I've lived through in my 65 years in the United States. He is a danger to this country and he's a danger to the world, and God help us truly if somehow he finds a way to claw into another term, because I fear for global stability if that's the case. I hope I was a little bit clear, but let me just.
Very upfront and clear. So how would the American people and businesses, particularly the kind of businesses that we work with here at the Chamber, so they are businesses with both a foot in Sweden and in the United States, where open borders, trade policy, visas, things of that sort are important. But what of Biden's proposed policies do you believe would better work for the American people? I mean, the American people tend to go to the voting booth saying, am I better off now than I was 4 years ago? If I am, I'll give the guy in the White House another chance. If not, I'll go for the other one. So will people look at their situation and say, I'm better or worse off? And how will the Biden proposed policies do anything different or better than Trump's?
It isn't so simple in American politics because Trump represents basically high school educated older men who have tremendous resentments against the demographic changes in this country, the changes of women's role in this country, the changing role of minority groups, the sexual rights that have been extended. And so we're, as I think everybody appreciates, also in a culture war. And that's why it's a little bit hard to read the circumstances. If we're really, are you better now than 4 years ago? There isn't an objective indicator that isn't much worse right now. So that's not even a close call. But that's not why these all-white rallies are so enthusiastically pumping up Trump, or why a Supreme Court nominee was approved in about 6 days with no hearings, no nothing. This is a culture war that we're in. Sweden has something similar going on, but at a much, much lower scale. This is a ferocious culture war that has divided the United States. We don't know how it's going to come out next week. Probably Biden's going to win because the factors that you've said are operative. So the swing votes will go in Biden's direction, and 2016 was close. But what's incredible to me is that with this abusive, I would say literally clinically psychopathic president, he still has a 42% approval rating. That is an identity factor. That's not because they're voting their economics or anything else. That's because of who they are, where they are, and how this country is divided. Boy, is it divided right now. So what we need is a president who doesn't do what Trump does, for example, like you just heard from Philipson, bunch of nonsense, sorry, not the person, but what he was saying. Oh, they're going to punish the red states for trying to have decent government in this country. That's what you heard. That's why we haven't had more funding, because Trump's main goal has been to stop funding going to California and New York, because they're not part of white, red America, the center of America, which is Trump's base. So this is such nastiness. We have huge budget deficits in New York, for example, $8 billion at the city level. They're firing teachers, first responders, policemen, because of budgets, because of a collapse of the economy. And Trump is more interested in punishing the blue state city than he is in getting America operating properly during this period. That's the culture war that we're in, and it's absolutely horrendous. Now, Biden is a moderate, decent, nice man. I've known him for a long time. He's a good, decent person, and when he says he's going to govern for the whole country, he means it. When he says something is absolutely as radical in the American context as saying that everybody should have health care, can you imagine? I don't know how that would go down in Sweden, but in the United States, that's nearly communist, we're told, to say that everybody should have health care. He means it. He means that people shouldn't be dying and suffering because they can't pay their health bills, which is the current reality. And this has been our big fight for years, that Trump and the Republicans don't want to pay for health care for poor people, because for them, poor people mean not their people. And this is what this has been all about for so long. So Biden, I think the simplest way to say it is we would take baby steps towards what is considered absolutely natural in Sweden. Let me put it a different way. Sweden's spending on the budget and taxation as a share of GDP is, I didn't look it up, I should have, something like 45% of GDP right now. Okay? In the United States, we're at 30% of GDP. Suppose I told you tomorrow that Sweden is going to cut its budget by 1/3. Would society really continue to be civilized in Sweden if you cut 1/3 of the public sector and said, well, you have to figure out, maybe it's those migrants that don't believe it, that don't deserve it. Maybe they shouldn't be getting guaranteed health care or benefits, or maybe they shouldn't be in schools. That's what we're doing in this country. So we need to take some baby steps towards decent, normal social democracy. That means that we tax ourselves enough that we can actually provide basic services, and that we have a whole country that's united, not red states that hate the blue states, which is what this is about. You know, our technologies are pulling us into wider inequality. The digital world is not friendly to low-skilled, less educated workers, because they're getting automated out of their jobs, whether it's in the factories, whether it's in the mines, whether it's in agriculture, or whether it's in the shops or the offices. These are now automated processes. And so we have widening underlying inequalities. That's happened in Sweden also. But if you don't have government to offset that by ensuring that everybody has access to health care, to education, to family leave, you know, in the United States, we don't have 1 day guaranteed of paid leave. We don't have 1 day guaranteed of family leave. We don't have 1 day guaranteed of vacation time. This country is barely civilized given its wealth. And that's what this debate is really about. Because what Philipson was just saying, I only caught the end of it, is they want to cut more taxes from what is already the most undertaxed society, so that the rich can be even richer than they are. How much richer can you be? We have Jeff Bezos now. This morning, his net worth is $190 billion. I'll say it again, $190 billion, one person. The top 4 Americans this morning, Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, have personal net worth, not their companies, personal, of $530 billion. And we can't see fit to tax them. So what Trump wants to do is cut taxes more. He wants to bail out his own personal company because probably bankrupt. And it's a game. And it's a game that is solved by telling white working class people, there are people worse off than you, and we're going to make sure that they stay worse off than you. And that is American politics right now. I don't think it's going to work next Tuesday, but I think it's a very close call. If Biden is elected, Europe will have a partner again. Right now, Europe has an enemy. Trump really wants to break the European Union. That's not a small point. That's not a myth. Trump hates the European Green Deal. Trump hates anything about the transition away from fossil fuels. Trump hates the Paris Climate Agreement and walked out of it. If Trump wants to buy Ericsson from Sweden, please, for God's sake, don't sell Ericsson to America. This is one of the empire's crudest ideas, that since the US couldn't get around to making 5G, we'll just buy Sweden's company and make it an American company and do it instead. This is what's on their minds. I've never seen anything like it in my 40 years of being an economist. It is nasty, awful, destructive. And when it came time to actually keep our economy functioning in the midst of a pandemic, they failed that entirely also. So I see nothing but grimness if he gets reelected, but I see a lot of hope that we could at least start moving towards decency if Biden comes into office.
One question for you, besides the income tax rate and so forth, corporate tax rate is something, that's very much on the mind of our businesses, and where one of the things that people do give the Trump administration credit for is the fact that the corporate tax rate was lowered. And it's a question I get asked all the time. If Biden prevails, will that corporate tax rate be raised again?
I sure hope so. I'm going to be first in line to campaign for that. I'd like to see it go back up to 35%. Biden talks about 28%. But look, with the inequality that we have, with the huge shift of income towards corporate profits out as a share of national income, with the decline of labor income, how could we not do this? With the increasing monopolization and rents in our economy in the corporate sector, how could we not do this? Why should we be giving 21%, or obviously in effective terms, far less than that, to Amazon, Google, Facebook? It's unbelievable to have such a low tax rate. So it should go up worldwide because we need more revenues so that we can be more like Sweden, not less revenues so that we can be more like Brazil. This is really what's happening in this country. So we need to collect more tax revenues. And the corporate sector is a good place to start. Wealth taxation would be another place to start. I would be surprised if Swedish businesses really believed that America should have a 21% corporate tax rate, and that is the right framework. If it is, I'd like people to write to me to explain that, but I'll write back to them and compare the Gini coefficient in Sweden and the Gini coefficient in the United States and explain why we need some taxation on the wealth in this country rather than viewing wealth as our paramount aim when it's so overwhelmingly held by the top tiny share of Americans.
So if you are a Swedish business or a business doing business in the United States, whether you're Swedish or American, and you had to draw up a list of pros and cons between looking at a Trump administration and economic policy versus a Biden administration and economic policy therein. How would you make the case for a Biden, and sort of specifically, what are the measures you think that a Biden administration would do differently than the Trump administration has, and how that affects the sort of bottom line on doing business in the United States?
Well, I would say, honestly, shouldn't the US look more like Sweden in how we operate, in our social justice, in our fairness? If I tick off every one of the basic standards of decency in Sweden, how workers are paid, their healthcare access, their education access, their vacation time, their leave time, family policies, income support, training. I'm sorry, I'm in a less developed country in the United States, but I believe that we should have the right to live like Sweden. And this is what I would say to a Swedish company. I want to look more like Sweden. And I don't want Swedish companies here just being parasitical on low tax rates that are favoring a small elite. I'd like Swedish companies to say, wouldn't it be safer for the world if America were a decent, normal country, not at each other's throats, not divided in this incredibly painful way, and without a psychopath as president, because the man is clinically nuts. So that's what I would expect somebody in Sweden to say. My view is that in the end of the day, we're much more likely to stay in peace. We're much more likely to have a normal economic life. Every time these extremists come to power in this country, we end up in chaos. We ended up in chaos with George W. Bush Jr. He was another irresponsible president, though compared to Trump, he really was Abraham Lincoln. But look at what a disaster it was. They had the same tax cuts and deregulation, and they gave us the 2008 financial crisis. Now we have the lawlessness in this country under Trump. It has helped to create a global debacle. I would ask a Swedish company, also as Swedish individuals, wouldn't it be good if the United States were part of the World Health Organization? Wouldn't that help to stop a global pandemic? How could you ever consider voting for somebody who pulls the US out of WHO at the height of the biggest pandemic in 100 years? That's a psychopathic action, by the way. And he did that. How could you support a US president under any calculation that pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement, says, oh, don't worry, it's going to get cooler, knows and ridicules the opposition for wanting to take climate change seriously? There is nothing on the other side of the ledger. Either we have a decent world or not. The name of the game isn't maximum corporate profits over the next 6 months or a year or two. The name of the game is a sustainable planet. And least of all, do I have to explain that to Sweden, which is a world leader in all of this. So believe me, think about having Trump as your prime minister. I think it's unimaginable. We couldn't even consider it. Well, that's how I feel as an American. I wouldn't wish it on you, and I certainly don't wish it on me for any more than this minimum stay until he's replaced by Biden.
And on the subject of climate change, Joe Biden has pledged to commit several $1 trillion to alternative energy and climate change resilience. What do you think businesses, foreign businesses, such as Swedish, innovation in the clean tech sector and so forth, can hope to reap from that?
A lot. This will be a huge market, a lot of investment, and tremendous opportunities. And in the US Northeast, for example, it is your neighbor Equinor, formerly Statoil, who's doing a lot of the offshore wind in the US Northeast. there are going to be tremendous opportunities for a massive retooling of our economies under the European Green Deal and under a Biden climate plan. He's talking about $2 trillion of investment spending over the first 4 years. I'm releasing today a study that I helped to oversee on the green transition in the United States. It's essentially a US version of the European Green Deal. It spells out step by step what will be needed. But if you are a company that does renewable energy, smart grids, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, or any part of that value chain, there's going to be a tremendous market for that in the coming years. So get in there. Of course, this is a major part of our public investment need and strategy for the coming 30 years. What Trump has done, it's unimaginable, but he spent his 4 years trying to save coal, oil, and gas. He's trying to save either the 19th century industry of coal or the 20th century industry of oil and gas. He doesn't have a clue about the 21st century. His campaign bills are paid for by the oil and gas industry, and the coal industry is so bankrupt it couldn't even pay campaign bills anymore. But none of that investment is taking place. The pipelines have been scrapped because they're not viable anymore. The banks, who are not exactly our leading moral force in the United States, are pulling back from financing the fossil fuel sector because they see there's no future in it, not out of principle, but because they see there's no future in it. So Sweden has a lot of clean tech because Sweden has been at this at least since 1990 with a strong carbon tax. Sweden pioneered this. It cleaned up its act early. Stockholm cleaned up its act very early. You know a lot about how to do this. And we're just getting started because the hold of our big oil lobby was so strong until today that we've not properly carried this out, but Biden's determined to carry it out.
I'm going to ask you a question on deregulation. As I'm not sure you heard Mr. Felipson talk about the deregulation and the many positive effects that it had on businesses and the economy as a whole. I'm going to venture to guess that you have a different approach to that question, and we'll ask you to talk about that a little bit. What in the regulatory world, and I'm not talking about EPA regulations and so forth. I'm really talking about more in the finance and sector, and how you think that may have either hurt or hindered the economy and businesses going both now and going forward.
It's really easy to get economic activity rising in the short term by deregulation. You do a lot of destructive things that make profits, but profits is not a measure of social value. Getting companies to pollute more, to chop down more trees, to endanger their own workforces, to not have to take precautionary steps on pollution. Or when it comes to finance, we have a repeated history of Republican administrations deregulating the financial sector, ending up in financial crisis. The reason for regulation is what good public economics explains, that these systems don't work properly under an unregulated approach. The regulations are there not out of orneriness. They're there because of asymmetric information or multiple equilibria or externalities or other reasons why markets collapse, as they did in 2008 when financial deregulation had run its course. But Trump has especially loved environmental deregulation because it's easy. If you don't believe in climate change, or I don't believe is the wrong word, if you don't care, then sure, deregulate. But by the way, you'll get more business. And this is the primitive idea that things that we measure in market activity as somehow a measure of the social good, we've understood in economics for 250 years that's not right. And Pigou explained, A.C. Pigou explained 100 years ago why it's dead wrong to think in those terms. But the United States is the country of short-term thinking and greed, not proper social accounting, whether it's climate, whether it's financial sector collapse. By the way, Sweden deregulated its banks also in the 1990s and ended up with the biggest financial crisis in Sweden's history. So I don't have to remind Sweden about the costs of financial deregulation. It was the #1 debacle for Sweden in macroeconomic policy in modern history. And this is just so plain when it isn't infected by greed. I'm going to have to run, I'm afraid, because I'm about to start a seminar at Oxford in a moment.
You were very kind to give us your time, and I know you were on a very tight time schedule, so we really appreciate you squeezing us in here. And
absolutely delighted. Sorry to be, I hope, not too vulgar or crass, but I did want to explain why I think this is the most important election in our modern history and why I believe Trump is the worst president we have ever had in the United States. And that's heartfelt, and it's not the gimmicks or partisanship. It's really an expression of the danger that I feel for our country.
Here's your answer to that. Really appreciate Professor Sachs' candor and passion. So you were neither vulgar nor crass. You were candid and passionate. So thank you for your candor.
Very good. Thanks to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to email them to us. And we look forward to presenting more of these webinars of interest. And those of you who can vote, make sure you vote on Tuesday. Thank you.